Okay, so to start off, you would have learned in Prue's session earlier, so Associate Professor Prue Bramwell spoke to you all about the different types of blended learning that you can do. And my journey has incorporated a few different types, and I think that's really important to emphasize early on, that there's not just one type of blended learning. There are lots of different approaches that you can use in blended learning, and there's lots of different activities that you might embed into your learning environment so that your students can really benefit the most. And I'm going to loop back to that point right at the end, but it's important to highlight early that there is just that no one size fits all approach. And if there was, it would make blended learning redundant. It would be the same as just having a traditional approach. Everyone would get used to the same sort of thing when it comes to blended learning. So when it comes to your class, finding what works for you and your topic and customizing it for your experience is really important. So today I'm going to show you some examples of what I use and what works for me. But keep in mind, are just examples. What might work for you might be different. So you might come away from this session thinking, oh, Jess, that's a fantastic example. I'll use that too. Or this might stimulate your own ideas where you come up with something new and novel that I haven't thought about. So a little bit of an overview. At RMIT University in Melbourne in Australia, I work as a lecturer in nutrition. So that is part of our STEM college in the School of Science. And I teach courses at RMIT, so teaching the students on campus in Melbourne. But as I mentioned beforehand, I also generally get the opportunity to travel to China as part of my work and teach over there. So I'm in China usually every 6 months, or now in that online environment teaching my Chinese cohorts. And I'm responsible for 2 courses at RMIT. So the first one's called Nutrition, Health and Disease. I run that to undergraduate and postgraduate cohorts. And I also run a course called Food Toxicology, Allergens and Health. So when I'm in RMIT Melbourne, those courses go for 12 weeks plus another couple of weeks of assessment time. So altogether, it's a 16-week block that I get to teach my content in. But when I go to China, I actually take over about 8 weeks worth of content and run my courses in what I refer to as an intensive mode. So 8 weeks of the course, but in 2 weeks. So essentially, when I'm with students, every day they are learning the equivalent of what my students in Melbourne would get over the week. So it's a fast-paced process, and they get a lot of information at once. Some other noteworthy career history to add, and Jacko mentioned that I'm an accredited practicing dietitian, and that's regulated by Dietitians Australia. Before I started at RMIT, I did work in hospital settings, so I did work with patients, and I think that's really strengthened my ability to teach students about nutrition and health now. And I'm also more recently one of the superstars of STEM for Science and Technology Australia. So that's an acclaimed national program where they select the top scientists and technologists, engineers and mathematicians. And we are in a 2-year program designed to smash stereotypes about what women in science looks like and really promote science and education and get more young people into those careers. I'm also quite active on social media, so Instagram and Twitter, I've got the logos down there. I know the access to those isn't always available in China, depending on whether you can get onto those accounts or not. But if you do have those accounts, you can follow me at Dr. Jess Danaher. I'm regularly posting on there about research and teaching works that I'm contributing to. So going into my teaching philosophy at RMIT really changed after I first began. So I commenced in the end of 2017, and it wasn't until the next year, 2018, that I began teaching and course coordination. And unfortunately, and I'll show you the results in a couple of slides' time, The outcomes of my courses in terms of what the students thought about my teaching and my delivery wasn't so great in my first year of teaching. In 2018, I delivered courses with a really traditional teaching approach. I ran lectures where I would stand up and speak at the students for 2 or 3 hours at a time, taking a few breaks in between. But I would also run like a tutorial session. So students would come in and I would say, go and search this information, come in, and then we'll do a question answer style session. And I thought that that worked all right in my first year. But what I quickly came to find out was that it wasn't really working for the students. They didn't really enjoy being in a class where they were being spoken at for 2 or 3 hours at a time. And what they wanted was a redesign of that course. They found some of the content a bit boring to engage in, and they wanted to spend their time when they were participating in university activities in that live session to be more interactive and engaging. So I decided to change my teaching philosophy from 2019 onwards. And currently that really involves creating blended learning environments that include a variety of strategies that personalize the learning experience, particularly by giving students a degree of ownership in their assessments. So that's not really what I'm talking about today, assessments, but I do some negotiated and interest-led assessment practice. What I will be talking about today is that blended learning environment that I use to facilitate that sort of assessment and that ownership of the course. I really believe that my current teaching approach and the philosophy that I'm trying to achieve is to inspire students by accounting for their individual and diverse ways in which they learn, and by creating unique learning experiences that empower them to achieve success. Now, when I say accounting for the unique, diverse ways in which they learn, I'm recognizing that not all students learn by sitting in a room and being spoken at in what would be classified as a traditional regular lecture. Some students learn by doing, some students learn by reading, some students learn by watching something happen first and then having a go. So by just doing traditional lectures, I was only really accounting for people that learn by listening and not everybody else. And I think that my blended learning activities that I'll cover with you today really allow for students of all different learning types to get something out of my courses. So with that philosophy in mind, I changed my teaching approach. And like I mentioned before, I used to just run my classes as traditional lectures where I spoke at students, and sessions that were in conjunction to that were very question answer format typed. So what I do now, my scholarly teaching approach and that new teaching approach that I have, it utilizes guidelines called the Universal Design for Learning guidelines. And they're guidelines which focus on encouraging design opportunities where students have autonomy in decision making. So again, giving students that ownership in the class and getting them involved more. So 2 things I do, I have online lectures, and these are pre-recorded. I record all my lecture content in about 15 to 20-minute chunks, I call them. And having them pre-recorded and available at the start of the semester allows students to engage in flexible, technology-enhanced content delivery. The idea of having them ready to go and students engaging in them whenever they want means that my students can personalize their learning schedule. So instead of coming to class and hearing me speak for 2 hours, they can listen to the recordings throughout the week at a time that suits them best and suits their needs. I also then run, and this is in replacement of the lectures I was running. So instead of the 2-hour block where I am talking at students, now instead, when I see students during that time, I run what I call workshops instead. So those workshops are run weekly and they involve interactive team-based tasks that are aimed at cementing the learning from the recorded content. So students should be listening to the online recordings prior to attending. They can do that at whatever time suits them. They just have to come prepared. And when they come to class, we engage in meaningful learning activities. And some of those I will go through in detail in the next couple of slides. And that's why I've highlighted that dot point. That's really the crux of what we're looking at today. And I touched on before with that philosophy being ownership and design, that I allow students to complete authentic assessments that might be creativity enabled or personal interest led projects. So usually in those weekly workshops, there is time dedicated for students to liaise with me as the teacher on their assignment work. And I just didn't get that opportunity when I used to use that 2-hour slot to talk at the students. The opportunity to form relationships with the students just wasn't there. So now my students, they have the opportunity to negotiate their own assessment if they so wish. Not many actually take this up, but I think they like the opportunity, if they wanted to negotiate an assessment. But many of them, what they'll do is just choose from one of the pre-designed assessment topics that I've given. So I give a list of assessments and they get to pick which ones suit them based on how or what they want to learn. So not everyone in my class does the same assignments, but they still work towards achieving the same course learning outcomes. So before I go into the activities in terms of what I do in my workshops and how I structure those in a blended learning approach, what I want to talk to you about is why I really sell this as a fantastic tool to implement in your classrooms. I mentioned beforehand that my whole teaching philosophy and my approach changed in 2019, and that was because when I taught in 2018 in that very traditional style, it wasn't really working for the students. It wasn't that bad, but it wasn't as good as it could be. So this graph here, this is the course evaluation survey that RMIT ask our students at the end of every semester. So I teach 3 courses, nutrition, health and disease and food toxicology, but the nutrition, health and disease has 2 offerings for our undergraduate and postgraduate group. So three courses in total. So this here represents the average outcomes of those 3 courses each year. And we ask students a series of questions to provide us with a good teaching score, otherwise known as a GTS, and an overall satisfaction index, or an OSI. And you can see here that in 2018, when I was doing that traditional style approach, I was getting a 71% good teaching score and an 80% overall satisfaction on average. Still good results, but could be better. When I flipped to blended learning, that has only gone up. And you can see there, I've started about 94 and 95 across both the GTS and the OSI in 2019 and 2020, respectively. And this year, at the end of semester 1, so the first half of our teaching, I have gotten an average of 99% of good teaching scores and 100% across 3 courses for overall satisfaction index. So at this stage, I've embedded these blended learning models, and every year since 2019, I've refined them further and further to get them better and better. And I've essentially now hit the ceiling in regards to our survey outcomes. I don't think I can get much higher than that unless I got a 100% good teaching score as well next year. So I'm happy with where they are, because this shows that my students are happy with how I'm teaching as well. And a quote here, and this is from one of the evaluation surveys in 2019. This has easily been the best and most well-run course I've taken in the food technology part of my degree. And that's just one of the kind of quotes of that nature that I'm getting. Students also provide qualitative feedback, and they really like this sort of approach. I wasn't getting those types of positive comments when I ran a traditional approach back in 2018. So since embedding these blended learning style approaches, I have received a couple of awards. So the Executive Dean's Award for Teaching at RMIT, recognition of Outstanding Student Experience Awards, and AEMG, the group facilitating these sessions today, actually got this awarded in 2019, but based on 2018 work, was the Excellence Award in recognition of extraordinary achievement in teaching visit program in China. So I'd actually taught in China in 2017 first, and then refined my practices there in 2018, which isn't on this graph, but took some novel ideas over there. So today I am going to go over 3 different approaches that I've had to use over the last couple of years in terms of blended learning. The activities that I use are for the most part the same, but the approaches have had to adapt over time. And this is really just a consequence of the current disruptions that we've had in regards to COVID. So the first one I'll look at is what I do at RMIT. So when I'm here with my students in Melbourne and we are able to go to campus and there's no restrictions. So luckily for me, the first half of this year, we didn't have many restrictions in Melbourne. So I was able to see all my students face to face and form a really great relationship with them using that model. So that's a 2-hour block model. And as I mentioned before, that is in replacement of what would be a normal traditional lecture. So the lecture content is now online, and we do this instead when they come to uni. The second model that I'm going to highlight is my intensive mode model for blended learning workshops in China. So when I go and teach at the Nanjing University of Chinese Medicine. So particularly over, I think it was the end of 2019, I went over, and my colleague over there and I piloted a model and got feedback from students. So I'll show you a little bit about that later and what the Chinese cohort thought of this. But the school that I was working at the time, so Nanjing University of Chinese Medicine, they run their classes in 40-minute blocks, which meant that I just had to adapt my approach in a way to be able to fit the 40-minute model that was being run at Nanjing. And then lastly, I'm going to touch on my online blended learning workshop, which from what I've heard, a lot of this week's content and professional development has been around online blended learning. The first 2 models I'll show you were face-to-face, but I definitely now have to do online blended learning as well. And that's a result of COVID. So I have students that can't come to Australia at the moment, but are RMIT students. So this year I've taught students in Australia and in China, but also in Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, Sri Lanka, India, and Kuwait. So they haven't been able to come to Australia, so I've had to still deliver to them, whilst providing a equitable experience to the students that are learning on campus. I don't want anyone to be disadvantaged because they haven't been able to come to our on-campus hands-on face-to-face workshops. So I do something different online for them instead. I believe that because I've been able to embed my blended learning strategies both onshore in Melbourne and offshore in China and all those other countries I've listed, that this approach is both sustainable and it's agile. So you can change depending on the needs of our current disruptions. And just some blended learning data here in the bottom corner. I, this year, had a look at my attendance. And I know when I've taught in China previously, the Chinese cohorts are fantastic at attending, usually get really great attendance. In Melbourne, not so much all the time. Students tend to be a bit more relaxed when it comes to attending class. So I had a look at my attendance rates for students this year, and I was getting 73% as an average attendance on campus. It was 50% in 2019 when we were on campus last. So that had increased. And the thing that I really want to highlight there, it's gone up 23% attendance since I've started optimizing and really refining my blended learning strategies. But we've gone up 23% in a year where students, if they were sick, they couldn't come to campus. We had health declarations at RMIT that said, if you're unwell, you're not permitted. So we had all these extra pressures, and yet I'm still getting higher numbers because people want to engage in my classes. And I was getting 86 average attendance online, which compared to some colleagues using more traditional online approaches was a lot higher than what others were getting. Okay, so moving on, let's go to the approaches. So I said I'll go through the 3 different types. The first type that I use is the on-campus blended learning workshop. So you can see here on the side, I've said it's a 2-hour block. Now, really, it's actually 1 hour and 50 minutes at RMIT. I say 2 hour because it's a bit easier. But at RMIT, we do let students finish 10 minutes early so they can go to their next classes. So in that time, I've got here in pink times that are really centered around me as a lecturer. So in that class, I would use at the very maximum 30 minutes as an all eyes on me. Now, I said previously that 2-hour slot used to be the whole 2 hours was all eyes on me talking as a lecturer. But now it's only about 30 minutes. That's all I speak for. I say before this workshop, you should have, and I tell them what lectures they should have listened to or any tasks that they needed to complete. I provide a content overview. So with the lectures that they should have listened to, I generally pick 4 or 5 key slides or key points that I really want to highlight. And I do that to reinforce concepts, but also because I realize that there are some students who might come to class who haven't actually listened to the lectures, even though they're supposed to. So that just means that I've gone over the most important parts in 4 or 5 key slides. I also use that opportunity to provide assessment feedback, and I provide a showcase of a 3-2-1 activity that I will go through in the next slide in regards to what that involves. So that's 30 minutes at the very max. Sometimes it's a little bit less. And then we jump straight into the activities that I've got here in purple. Now, these activities over the next few slides, I have picked a few out and I will describe them in some more detail. So you might be able to look at these and say, I think this is a fabulous activity. I might use it in my course as well. Or you might look at it and say, oh, that wouldn't work for my course and this is why it wouldn't. Or I could better this activity by doing something new or novel that I haven't thought about yet. And I'd love to hear your ideas. So the different activities, I've got them here split up as to team-based, individual, or games and competition. I like to have fun with my students. I have to admit, I think in my first year of teaching, when I was talking at students and I wasn't getting great teaching scores, I also didn't find it to be the most engaging, fun course. I like to have a good time. So this kind of approach and these activities mean that I get to know the students and partake as well. And I think that's really another reason my scores for teaching went up so high, because students formed a relationship with me in these different activities. So with the team-based, just some examples, I have a 3-2-1 think, pair, share, which I'll talk about on the next slide. Also a task with credible versus non-credible news reviews, and teach and reteach concepts. So all of those I'll go through in a bit more detail on the next slide. We also do example assessment marking, which I'll talk about as well, some role plays and assembling curves and different team-based assessment work. So there's 6 of those I've chosen to go through in a bit more detail. In terms of individual tasks, I will talk a little bit more about case studies and pre and post topic reflections, and JAM, which is just a minute presentations. But as also supplementary individual tasks, I might set students the task of getting question and answers from journals, or listening to a video that an expert has provided and writing down their key takeaway points. In terms of games and competitions, the ones that we'll look at today is a memory or match with definitions game that's sometimes also called concentration. Cahoots is an online resource that can be used for games as well. We do a bit of nutrition myth busting in my courses, so I might quiz the students about what's correct or not correct in regards to nutrition, and then we'll talk about that as a group. There's also word searches and crosswords and giant Jenga trivia, which we'll touch on over the next couple of slides. So they're just some of the activities. I've put all of them there. Obviously, they wouldn't all run within an hour and 15 minutes I have for activities. But throughout my whole semester, so the 12 weeks I get to teach students, I will have a few of these in the different activity times I have, and I'd spread them out over the semester so students get a variety of tasks. I usually then finish off with about 5 minutes to go with any reminders. So before the next workshop, what they should be doing, and this might be listening to lectures or working on certain assessment tasks. And I find that I just can bring the class back to me right at the end, provide that summary and let the students go on their way. All right, so as promised, here are some examples in a bit more detail for you. So these next two slides are going to be examples of team-based activities. The first one is think, pair, share. So in this, I get students to come together and they usually have an A3 piece of paper and a pen, and they write down the things that they've learnt, or they think about what they've learnt, and then they come together as a team to write down 3 facts, 2 questions, and 1 opinion they have on the topic. So they think about it, they pair up, and then they share 3 facts, 2 questions, and 1 opinion. So this can be done in class with texters and some paper, or it can be done in online settings if you have a breakout group and students go together and they discuss it, and you get one person to write it down and then report back to the class. I would take these when I run them with students. I would take the questions and the facts and the opinions that students would write, and then the following week I would present those back. So it gave me the opportunity to write up the questions that they had and formulate a response and research any response to this rather than doing it on the spot. I had time to compile it. I also would run activity for my course Nutrition, Health and Disease called Credible versus Non-Credible Information. With nutrition, there's a lot of misinformation. There's a lot of news articles that aren't trustworthy, that might have bias or cherry picking of data or use scare tactics to frighten people into following a certain opinion. So what I would do is I would give students a range of articles, usually about 6 different articles, some of which I'd actually written myself. I would say it was from a news source, but actually I had put those together strategically. And students in groups would read through these articles and decide on what was credible information and what wasn't credible, using the information that they knew about science and the scientific method and so on and so forth. So the students had to discuss these. And then in class, I would get them under the banners of credible and non-credible. You can see there in that image, they would paste the title of the article. So I was able to see which ones they thought were credible and not credible. And that was the title that sits under them. Again, an activity that can be run in an online system, and instead you use breakout groups, and then students will put in a poll what they vote as being credible or not credible. Another activity, and I trialed this one this year. It only works face-to-face. I don't think it would work online. This, to me, this year, I trialed this. It's called Teach and Reteach, and I wasn't sure whether it would be a disaster or not, but it turns out it was a success. What I would do is I gave all the students in my classroom one of 4 coloured Post-it notes. So you can see here there's blue, there's yellow, there's pink, and there's one it's a bit slightly orange, but different to the yellow. And for each of these, they were given a topic. So if you had the blue Post-it note, you might be responsible for a topic on the Australian Guide to Healthy Eating. Everyone got a different topic depending on the colour that they had. I would then get students to prepare a 1-minute speech on their topic. So it could be anything about it, but it just had to be related to that topic. After that, I would get students to pair up. So, for example, I would tell the topic 1 in blue with topic 3 in pink to match, and students would have the opportunity to teach each other their topic. So they would provide their 1-minute speech to their partner. But then I would call swap, and I would tell the teams to swap. So maybe then the blue post-it note people have to go see the yellow post-it note people. But the next time when they swap, they had to teach the thing that they had just heard. So not their original topic. They had to reteach what their previous partner had taught them. And we kept doing this until everyone had an opportunity to listen to content and teach it back. So it was a really good way of all the students learning all 4 topics, but having to listen and then repeat something, a really great way to enrich learning. And the other thing I mentioned on that one, I said at the end to them, did you learn something new? And they all screamed out, yes. And then I said, did you make a friend? And they screamed even louder, yes. Like they really liked it to actually get to know people. I found before doing this topic, students would sit together all the time. And by changing the post-it notes and spreading them out, they actually just had to go find a person that they might not have spoken to before and get to know them. So it was actually a really great activity for building a bit of a community in the class as well. A couple of the other assessment activities that I run, example assessment marking. So in this, I, on the whiteboard, will make a grid, which is the rubric that I would normally mark them on. So I would say achieved or developing or not demonstrated at the top, and the different types of things I would mark them on going across. So that might be their content or their professionalism, or their aims and hypothesis. Whatever I'm marking on would go across the different rows. So I would provide students with an example assignment, and it was similar to what they would have to provide for their own assignment. And this example wasn't always an exemplar. Like generally they were okay assignments. They could be better in different sections. So what I would get the students to do is, again, come together as a group and discuss how they would mark the assignment if they were me. So they had to act as the teacher. Then once they had read the assignment and given it a mark, they would allocate that mark on the whiteboard. So say, put a post-it note up where they would mark a student. So at the end, I would look at the results and compare them, and I would talk to the students about if I got this assignment, how I would mark it. The benefit in that is it gave students a very clear idea very early what my goalposts were as the academic. So when I was going to later mark their work on a similar assignment, maybe a different topic, that they knew what my expectations were because they had seen an example and I'd spoken about how I would mark that. Again, I usually do that in class, or I did that this year, but it can be put in an online environment as well. If the example is sent around earlier, students can read it, go into breakout groups to discuss, and then you can poll, or if you have a whiteboard function, you could make up the rubric and have students indicate how they would mark it before moving on to a discussion as to how you as the teacher would mark it. Another good one, my students do not like this at the start, and then at the end of all of these sessions, they tell me how much fun they have, but I think they find this one a little bit scary. We do nutrition role plays. So students pick a person or a persona, and then they come up with a bit of a backstory behind it. And they take turns in being the consultant or the client. So this is a nutrition persona. Maybe they have type 2 diabetes or cardiovascular disease, or are struggling with weight-related issues. They have to be that person and have another student cancel them, and then they switch over and become the consultant whilst their partner is the client. So they don't like it at the start, but they come away with some really great skills. And again, could be run in a breakout room, but only if you have 2 people in there, it works the best. Another one is assembling dose response curves. In this, I provided students with all different elements of a dose response curve. This was for my course on toxicology. I provided them with a set of instructions and said, you must assemble this dose response curve correctly based on those instructions. The trick was that in the envelope, there was lots of extra parts added in. So it was to confuse them a little bit, and they had to sort through what parts in the envelope weren't relevant and what parts they were going to use in their dose response curve. Some individual activity examples. I said a lot of case studies. When I do question answer type activities, sometimes I might use journal articles. Sometimes I get students to listen to a podcast and then do answers, or watch something and then write answers. But case studies, I think, is really great for enriching the authentic experience, particularly in courses like mine based on nutrition, health and disease. I want my students to be able to read about a patient situation and then be able to act the right way and accordingly. So in these, I'd provide background information about clients or the case to the students, followed by a series of questions that require them to think critically about that case and that individual situation. That can easily be run online as well. With reflections, another individual activity, prior to engaging in particularly topics that were controversial, such as genetically modified food, I would ask students to write down what their opinions were of these topics. And then following the topics, I would ask them to reflect further. So had their opinions changed? How so? And it wasn't something that they necessarily had to share with the class. It was a private task. But I thought it was a really great one to get them thinking about the topic before they listened to it, and then reflecting on it afterwards and coming up with their own informed opinions. Another one I run with individual activities is jam presentations. So just a minute presentations. These can work online and they can work in class. So with a jam presentation, just a minute, students can select any topic in the course. So generally, I put this at the end of the course, maybe at the end of the semester or the end of my teaching visit, because they get to select any topic and prepare a 1-minute speech. Now, I don't give them very long to prepare because I want them to deliver it like an ad hoc conversation. I turn a timer on and I say, go. And a student will just have to deliver their 1-minute speech. And when it hits the minute, I'll say, next. And then the next person has to get up and do theirs. So in class, that will involve one person standing up. And when they're done, they sit down and the next person stands up and we move across the room. So if you've got 40 students, that's 40 minutes. And students will provide different perspectives and different topics. So it's a great way at the end to revise as a group because you're hearing different content. And what was important to the student usually comes through. In terms of games and competitions, I said before, I like to run games. I like to have fun with my students. I don't have games all the time because I don't want students to perceive my classes to be silly. There's a bit of time for fun and these kind of shenanigans, but most of it is team and individual based, with these games interspersed between the content. So one that I really like is called memory or concentration. Here, the students will team up and I provide them with a set of cards, and one card will have a definition and the other card will have a term. So these are all flipped so they can't see that information. If you've played concentration before or memory before, you'd be familiar with this game anyway. But as a team, students can flip 2 cards, no more than 2 at any given time. And what they must do is they must then match a term and a definition. And for my classes, this really worked well when I was teaching students about food additives, because I would have an additive like a sweetener and its definition, and students had to sort through all the cards to match them up. So once they have matched it, they put it to the side and their pool of cards decreases. I would make this a competition because the fastest team to accurately match those cards would win. So they had to remember where they put it as a group. They had to communicate as a group in regards to who's flipping what cards and where they remember the definition or the term being. And I will time it and I give a prize to the group that has done it the fastest. So they've worked together the best and had the good concentration. Word searches and puzzles are an individual game or task that I've got. So I create puzzles based on the course content. I might take words from the lecture content and students must find the missing word first. So maybe it's a sentence and a key word is missing, but it's in the lecture content. Once they find that word, they can use it for either a word search or add it to a crossword. So here, www.theteacherscorner.net, that's where you can go to make word searches and crosswords and other things. It's a very handy resource. You just put the words in and then it will generate it for you. The last one that I want to cover with you is giant Jenga trivia. Now, this one can't be used in an online format. It is a face-to-face task. So what I get students to do, again, this is a revision task. We do it at the end of semester for a bit of fun. They will pull out a block that has a number on it, and that number has a corresponding quiz question. And when teams pull out that block, they will receive that question. If they answer it correctly, then they score a point. If they don't answer correctly, then the other team gets a chance to answer that question. And if they get it right, they'll score a point and then be able to take their turn next. So it's a point systems. Usually my students say deduct 5 points for being the person or being the group that topples the Jenga down. So, you know, gives that incentive for them to not want to destroy the Jenga. And yeah, it's a good way of them revising the content in a quiz that's just been made that little bit more fun. So different quotes that have come from my courses. Students really like this. This is all 2021 quotes, so earlier this year. What is the best aspect of this course? Some of the comments I got back was each week Jess delivers interesting and engaging lectures, followed by an informative and enjoyable workshop, which really helps cement the learning from lectures. The workshops were very useful in revising the lecture material. Jess consistently goes out of her way to design and run activities that are interesting, engaging, relevant to the course content. Jess is easily the best lecturer I've had this semester. The content is easily digestible. The tutorial sessions are fun and engaging. Having recorded lectures to hear in my own time is the best aspect, so they love the course structure. They love the hands-on activities and that the content is explained really well in an easy to understand way and is entertaining. And the last one, that Jess goes out of her way to deliver some of the more boring content as interestingly as you could possibly make it. These were definitely not the types of comments I was getting in my first year when I was running more of a traditional approach. So taking this over to China, this is just here a timetable of my classes from 2019 when I went to China. I was teaching 60 students in this cohort. And generally when I get a timetable, every slot, so everything in colour here, the purple, the blue and the green, were the slots in which I was teaching. But because of room capacity issues, so I was teaching 60 students, but the rooms where I wanted to do blended learning would only hold 30 students at a time. So what I did is split students up in the Chinese cohort into 2 groups. So 2 groups of 30, so I could have them in a room. And instead I changed the timetable to have all students in on the Monday in the morning when I was over there. And then over the space of the week, the group 1 in blue, they had classes with me, so on organic foods and food additives, on genetically modified food and adverse reactions, and a revision. And in the green times, they were told that they could listen to the lecture content. So usually in Melbourne, students can listen to the lecture content whenever they like. But for the Chinese cohort, I said, okay, this is your time dedicated to listening to those. They could still have breaks when they wanted to or do other things, but that was the time that they were meant to be getting on top of the recorded lectures. With the group 2, I had the opposite. So you can see here group 2 is in green. So in the blue, that was their time to listen to recorded lectures because I had the other group in class. And then in the green, they came to class whilst the other group listened to their lectures. So that's how I managed teaching in China, just having the 2 groups and changing the timetable in such a way. What did the block look like though? You can see here it's very similar to what I showed you earlier when I showed the 2-hour model. When I was teaching intensive mode blended learning workshops in China, I had 40-minute blocks with students. So that meant that 5 at the very maximum 10 minutes, all eyes were on me, generally more 5 minutes. So a reminder of what they should have done before the workshop, a content overview if needed, and any feedback. We would then have 25 or 30 minutes with activities, exactly the same as those that I described earlier. So this model was culturally adaptable. All the activities that I have been able to use can also be used with different cultural cohorts. So I was able to take over team-based and individual games and competition activities I showed you earlier. And then, as always, I had a couple of minutes at the end to refocus the group and tell them what they needed to do before they came back to the next workshop. So if they were going to listen to recorded lectures, what to work on or what to listen to. I mentioned before I surveyed the students. So this was in 2019 when I was able to take the blended learning over there and pilot it with my fantastic colleague at Nanjing University of Chinese Medicine, Dr. Zhuan Li, who was very helpful in this process and getting the students to participate. We explained to students in the first session what was going to happen. So they were aware that they were going to split up into 2 groups, and that when they weren't in class, they had to listen to the lectures and then come to my class, and we're going to do things a bit differently to how they were normally taught and how I'd normally taught over there as well. I'd taught quite traditionally in China prior to that. So we got students to fill out a survey prior to completing that course and at the end of it. So a pre and a post-course survey. And what we found is that students reported an increased confidence in their ability to speak in English, their ability to listen to instructions in English, and their ability to read in English. That was all statistically significant. It was a shift from them feeling moderately confident in those things to feeling confident about themselves for those 3 criteria. We also found that 80% of students either agreed or strongly agreed to the statement, I feel excited about coming to Australia after experiencing this teaching style. And 83% either agreed or strongly agreed to the statement, I feel that this course has better prepared me to finishing my degree in Australia. So they were excited, but they were also more prepared to come to Australia and engage in that different teaching environment that we have in Melbourne and what I was doing with my Melbourne students. We also had a look at the grades. So the year prior, teaching the same course, I had taught in a very traditional format. So all the sessions I had with students, all the 40-minute blocks, well, most of those were traditional lectures where I spoke at the students, and then there were some where they did activities, but most of it was traditional lectures. In that year, 18.5% of students failed the exam. That was in the traditional teaching approach. When I used the blended learning model, that went down to 5.1%. So it's not just increasing the students' confidence in English, It's not just making them more enthusiastic and ready to come to Australia if they're doing that as part of their degree, but it's actually making them more likely to pass the course because they're engaging in the content in a way that is meaningful and interactive rather than just listening. We're catering to different learning styles, so more people are going to get more from this course. So you might be thinking now, many of the activities you've shown have been hands-on, and I've tried to explain when I have spoken about the different topics, how some can be used in an online environment in addition to on class. And the question I get often is, how do you accommodate to offshore students or those unable to access the university due to COVID-19, especially when I'm running on-campus workshops? So my answer here is by providing students with a one-stop shop workbook that includes recommended study activities. So the study activities could be reading a journal article and answering questions, or doing the same with a podcast. Things that were a bit more common in my traditional style approach that I had used, I'm now including still, but as recommended study activities. So students who did attend and could participate in class, they could do these if they wished to. But the students who couldn't attend, or in situations where they were online and the activity couldn't work in the online environment, maybe it was a hands-on activity that required something physical that it just couldn't happen in the online world, this then acted as a replacement. So made sure students had something that was an equivalent alternative. So for my online blended model, you'll see it looks the same again, that approach. I get a 1 hour block with students at RMIT if we're online. At the start, it's all eyes on me just for a little bit, but the same structure. We then have activities, same as those described earlier. The key difference is that activities are generally set ahead of time. So if they're doing a task such as looking at credible or non-credible articles, I will get students to read some of these before the class. So when they come into the class, it's all online discussions. That avoids dead air time where you're asking students to read something for the first time. So the students would have to come a little bit more prepared for these sessions. So when they had their 35 or 40 minutes of activities, we were doing things. And then at the end, before this next workshop, you should. So those journal articles or podcasts or case studies or activities that didn't require the hands-on gamified learning, for example, some of that worked really well here where students were in that online space. So the workbook, this is what mine looks like. I have a workbook for all my courses and I make one for my Chinese cohort as well. I actually started off making them for the Chinese cohorts and they worked so well that I decided to make them a common resource in my courses in Melbourne. So these include the course learning outcomes, so what the course is trying to achieve. I provide a syllabus, so the timetable of what students will be learning and when. For my Chinese cohort, I had started with a glossary and abbreviations as well, because I recognize that discipline English is not always the English that they've come to the class having learnt. So at the back, there'd be a list of maybe some uncommon words and their definitions, and abbreviations and what they stood for. I now still use that with my Melbourne students and they find it really helpful, but it's particularly helpful for my Chinese cohort. These workbooks also had the list of recorded lectures to engage in. So, lecture 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and what their names were and how long they went for. So students knew what to do and when. It had an overview of the workshops and space to write answers to any questions that would be done in the workshop, any assessment task reminders, and those recommended study activities. So for every topic, if there was an activity that was hands-on, I would have a recommended study activity to act as a replacement if needed, to cater for all the students. So this was all in one workbook. So students would take that with them, either in online settings, they would have it and they could type into it, or bring it to class as a book, as a hard copy, and write in it in class. So room to fill out the activities. So this is what one of the recommended study activities looks like. Read this article. This one's called Tailoring Dietary Approaches for Weight Loss. It was available in their Canvas course reading list. And then they would have to answer the following questions. So again, this was as a replacement if students could not attend, or if the original blended learning activity could not easily be hosted online. And all of the questions in my workbook had this kind of look to them with that space to add details to. So what was the best aspect of this course in regards to the workbook? So we've got comments this year such as the teacher provides us with a workbook in which allowed me to gain more understanding of the course when the teacher was teaching. The workshops are great and the workbook is a great idea to engage with the content. There was helpful revision questions from the workbook and the workbook was very useful. And students then can finish and graduate and still have that resource with them to go back and look at. Some last tips before we get into the breakout session that we've got. I also like to do weekly announcements with my students on their online learning management platform. I pre-schedule these. They usually come out on a Monday morning, same time, same day, same format. I write them the week beforehand and I set and forget. And what this means is students are getting this consistent messaging from me. I limit my announcements. I try to aim for just the one a week at the same time, same day, just so they know what to expect. It tells them what lectures to listen to, what we're doing in class, what they need to do with their assignments, and any other important messaging. I find if you message students too often, you lose impact because they start not listening to you anymore. If you limit it and be quite purposeful in your intent, you're going to get more engagement. The other thing is video editing. So I haven't really touched on it today, my chunking of lectures and the recorded content. But one thing I like to do is use video editing software to update my lectures when necessary. So, for example, in nutrition, health and disease, I do a lecture on hypertension. Now, the pathophysiology of hypertension doesn't really change. The anatomy of the heart does not change. The dietary strategies to treat hypertension don't really change year to year, maybe slight changes in recommendations. What does change every year is the statistics. So instead of recording an entire lecture just to change the statistics and keep my content current, I use video editing software to embed new content and remove old content. That means that it might take me 5 minutes to make a change that otherwise would have taken me 20 minutes to re-record. So that's how I save my time and repurpose my time for more meaningful interactions with students, such as those workshops. I do have a video there, that's a hyperlink, a video on how to update your lectures. Lastly though, my most important tip, be authentic. There's no one-size-fits-all blended learning approach. If so, it would make it redundant. So be authentic, not just to your course and the topic, but to you as well. I like to have fun. I'm an energetic person. So I like to use activities that suit my style. And if I wasn't that person and I was trying to put it on, I think students would see through that and they would think that I'm not being authentic. So be authentic to yourself. Consider what works for your course and seek advice. So thank you for listening, and hopefully that stimulated lots of different ideas. So your task, I want you to think about this session. So you've learnt about various blended learning approaches, different models and different activities that I use. I want you to use this information that I've presented to you to plan a blended learning topic that you teach. So I want you to think about something you teach, how you might be able to incorporate blended learning activities or strategies, and describe this. So it could be something I already do that you've listened to today and thought that's a great idea, or something new and novel that you have thought of. So I want you to think about what approach or approaches would you use and why.